The USMCA is coming along well. I think that hopefully it's going to get approved quickly. Everybody wants it. It's in Congress right now. It's in the House. As you know, Canada's totally in line and Mexico's totally in line. And now it's up to us to get it passed. Hopefully they can act quickly because we can have that done very, very fast. If we can get support from really the Democrats in Congress, Nancy Pelosi, they have to put the bill forward. People want it to happen. Let's see what happens.
Ratification of the new NAFTA, though Trump won't call it that, is expected to top the agenda next week when the Prime Minister visits U.S. President Trump at the White House. Besides trade, the two leaders are also expected to discuss China's detention of two Canadians. Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor were detained after Canada arrested Meng Wanzhou on a request from U.S. authorities. So, what should we expect to come from next week's meeting? And what would represent a successful visit for each leader? Laura Dawson is the director of the Wilson Center's Canada Institute. She joins me from Washington. Colin Robertson is a former diplomat and is the vice president and fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. He's here with me in the studio. Folks, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
Laura, let's start with you. NAFTA is expected to be one of the real key issues at this meeting. You heard Donald Trump mention Nancy Pelosi in that clip. Does having Trudeau there help him convince the Democrats to support his trade deal?
Yeah, absolutely. Canada and the U.S. right now, miraculously, are right in line on this deal. They've achieved a successful text that all sides are happy with. This is a time for Justin Trudeau to remind Donald Trump that he's really got an ally in Canada, to push the importance of the deal, the importance of the deal for Americans, for those American interests that Trump also wants to promote, particularly agriculture, auto sector. And then once he's got the president suitably reminded of Canada's alliance, then he moves in on something more important like China.
Okay, well, let's talk a little bit more about the NAFTA, Colin, in terms of Trudeau. When Mike Pence was here, there was the suggestion that he wanted to use Trudeau, the progressive liberal star, to some degree globally, as to help him convince the Democrats to come on board with this. Can it work that way? Do you think it helps?
I think it helps, and I think it would help a lot if Prime Minister, when he's in Washington, went up and saw Nancy Pelosi and the leadership of the House Ways and Means Committee, the Democrats, because that's the block. And if they can get through the House, then it will sail through the Senate. But I think, again, we've been very good at working Congress through the negotiations on the new NAFTA. We should continue that, and it helps us with leadership. The Prime Minister, after all, is in a sense leader in the House of Commons, so he goes up to see Speaker Pelosi, who is the leader of the majority party in the House.
Laura, Nancy Pelosi seems pretty firm, though, on a lot of things she wants to see change with NAFTA potentially, and there is some resistance in her ranks. Do you think the Prime Minister could change her mind at all?
I think potentially. Overall, holding up the NAFTA is not a winning position for Nancy Pelosi. She doesn't necessarily want to give the president a win, but there's a lot of sectors in the United States that are being, held hostage. Their welfare is being held hostage as long as this deal doesn't go through. I spoke to a group of senior Democrats last week, and they were quite surprised, I think, by the level of destabilization that the absence of the agreement, or this agreement in a void, is causing, not just for Americans, but for Canadians as well. And for those folks, that relationship with Canada is very important. And I think they would like to kind of help restore bilateral relations that have been kind of fractured over the last 2 years.
Colin, one of the other big issues on the agenda is obviously going to be China, the detention of the two Michaels, Kovrig and Spavor. What can Donald Trump do to help Justin Trudeau with this diplomatic mess?
He can tell the Prime Minister that he's not going to conclude a deal with China without the release of Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig. That's what the Prime Minister wants to hear. We got into this mess because the Americans have got to help us. I don't think they've been helpful as they could be. I think you mentioned earlier, Mr. Oliphant said there have been 30 countries backing Canada. My gosh, we should have 130 countries backing us on this issue. We need the Americans to shoulder more because we are collateral damage to really the China-U.S. dispute.
Trump doesn't seem to mind collateral damage, though, in the way he does politics. So do you think he could Trudeau could convince him to do something like that?
Based on the past, as you know, Mr. Trump is his own character. I just hope that it's. I know the Prime Minister hopes that this is a more successful visit than having Mr. Trump when he was in Charlevoix last year.
Yeah, yes. I couldn't agree more. I mean, there's really only 2-3 things that the president is going to be able to kind of keep on his agenda. Canada can't ask for a lot of things or put a lot of things on the table, but that China issue has got to be front and center. Canada can't do anything about it on its own. It's going to require ceasefire intervention from the U.S. at the highest level. The White House saying, can you fix it for my friend Justin? They really need a break here.
Do you think you could ask Trump to drop it? I mean, this is something that's been suggested. We've seen the reports with former Prime Minister Chrétien has suggested that the way out of this is to release Meng Wanzhou. I mean, Colin, is this the sort of thing a Prime Minister can go and ask the President to do when they have been adamant that the rule of law stands?
I think the Prime Minister says to the President, if the President isn't responding, he says, look, you got us into this fix. You talked about doing a deal which completely undermines the rule of law. He's since been disavowed by his Department of Justice and his State Department. But I do think the Prime Minister has to play a bit of hardball with the President, because I think that's a language the President understands. That's how he is. He's a bully. And so I think the Prime Minister, who has been very genial, but I think he has to stand up in this case, because especially in those closed-door sessions where nobody else knows what's going on, but I think he's got to show a bit of spine against Mr. Trump, because Trump understands that language.
Laura, do you think that's the sort of thing Canada could do here? Ask the Americans to drop the extradition of the Huawei exec?
Absolutely. Ask the U.S. to cut it off at its source. As the minister, Mr. Oliphant, was saying, you just can't, Canada has to follow the rule of law. Canadian voters expect that of Canada, even though it is very, very painful for Canada. So the change with China has to come, I think, from the United States. And I think that's entirely possible. I think the thing the Prime Minister really has to avoid is trying to do his own campaigning, his own electioneering for the Canadian elections coming up in October, and trying to bounce those off the White House. If he starts opening up issues that the President doesn't want to talk about, state-level issues like the abortion issues in various states, I think that the President's going to close his ears.
Colin, how do you think that will play? I mean, it seems like this trip is to deal with the bilateral issues and maybe try to get some help in the run-up to the G20, though.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the President's going to bring up defense, and the Prime Minister will point out we're in the midst of the biggest rearmament. We're moving now forward on purchase of new warplanes, what we're doing with the Australians, getting some in the meantime. And, of course, we're putting out a ship a year. I was just down earlier this week in Halifax and toured the shipyard there and saw the Harry DeWolf, and that's what the Americans want to hear. And I'm pointing out what we've done. You just talked about Mali, but where we are in Latvia, that's a language, because the President will push us on numbers, and I think the Prime Minister correctly pushes back and said, hey, we're there when you want to. We have the capability. We're in every mission that you want us to be at. We're doing sanctions work off Korea. We've just increased our partnership with Japan. We are a reliable ally. We'd like you to be a reliable trade partner.
Laura, this is the start of a big foreign trip month for the Prime Minister, going to Washington and then leading to the G20 later this month in Japan. One of the issues that Trudeau's pushing is World Trade Organization reform. Trump likes to weaponize tariffs. He's kind of the protectionist in chief. Is this an issue even worth bringing up when you're talking to the President?
I think it's absolutely essential. I mean, the details are complex, and we know details aren't his thing, but right now the U.S. holds the cards for not just WTO reform, but the U.S. could actually collapse the WTO. Next December, the appellate body essentially disappears in the WTO. Unless the U.S. can nominate folks to that body, there's no mechanism of dispute settlement. That means the WTO collapses. That worries me more than any of the other economic issues I think that are in front of us right now. We need U.S. rules leadership on this stuff. Canada can't just go around the U.S. and hope that the WTO gets better. It's got to have the U.S. driving the reform and finding a deal that works for everybody.
Colin, how do you think Trudeau could get Trump on board with WTO reform? What's the winning argument in that conversation?
That the President from the outset has said that WTO isn't working, so we are taking a leadership role in fixing it along the lines he's talking about. We'll come up with new rules, reforming it. We'll deal with things like intellectual property, with state support for state-owned enterprises. This is what we want to do. We'll also reform, as he said, the dispute settlement mechanism. We brought together a group of like-minded countries from around the world, not just the usual suspects from Europe, but we've got African countries, we've got Latin American countries, we've got Asian countries. We've been working hard at this. We're doing the spade work, Mr. President, but now we need your support. And we've been, of course, talking to other members of the administration. So they know what we're doing. And Robert Lighthizer, who has an interest in seeing this, I think he sees the value in what we're doing. If we get the Americans on side, then you can put pressure on the Chinese, because ultimately you have to have both those players in this as well, especially if you continue to move as the WTO has by consensus. But we need to bring that pressure and have the U.S., who's been the champion of this system from the beginning until Donald Trump, to say, yes, we see the value in this. And we put a lot of effort in this. It's like what we're doing on Venezuela with other like-minded, which the Americans are actually happy to see us do. countries like Canada have to be constructive and have to stand up in the absence of the Americans, because for Donald Trump, it's still America first.
You mentioned in a recent op-ed that the G20 coming up is a real test of Trudeau's foreign policy more broadly. What do you mean by that?
I mean that after he's now in his 4th year, this is a real test of those relationships that the Prime Minister has been able to forge, because we've got real issues at stake, as Laura said and as you pointed out at the outset. First of all, freeing Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig. We need international support. Yes, it's fine to have a few countries speak out of me, but we need all of those G20 countries saying, yeah, this is wrong, China. You should be doing so. So this is a test of those relationships that the Prime Minister has talked about. Canada's back. This is a test of Canada's back.
Okay, Laura, final thoughts from you on that?
Yeah, as much as there's a lot of substantive things going on, we have to remember that this is a performer president. So when Justin Trudeau meets with this guy, he's got to make sure that there's some sizzle, that there's some performance to it. So first of all, they got to talk about basketball. He's got to do a little victory dance for the Raptors. And secondly, Ivanka Trump. She was the secret weapon in the visit last time Justin Trudeau was there. Women, peace, and security. We were just talking about how the Prime Minister has appointed a Canadian ambassador for women, peace, and security. Ivanka Trump has just announced her own initiative for women, peace, and security. Bring those two things together. It's a winning combination and something that I think the president will be very supportive.
Yeah, we're going to have a big news week next week, I think. I'd like to thank you both very much, Laura Dawson and Colin Robertson. Thanks for making the time.
Thanks, Dave.
Hi, I'm Vashi Kapellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video. Thanks for watching.